All this week, ABC and Channel 5 have presented North and South, the mini-series chronicling the days before the Civil War broke out. And today, in the final installment of the series, A House Divided, special correspondent Clark Booth looks at the myth and romanticism that surrounded the Civil War.
It ended in the lovely valleys of Appomattox, with the two principal foes quietly coming to terms in the kitchen of Farmer McLean's farmhouse. Then Lee bid farewell to his troops, and the two armies, North and South, incredibly began singing Auld Lang Syne. Robert Penn Warren has said, at that very moment, the mystical conception of Southern identity developed into a cultural force to be forever known as the legend of the lost cause. In time, the romantic illusion conquered America, bringing us to accept the preposterous fantasy that the Old South was a Camelot, festooned with gallant rogues, high-spirited maidens, and flaming sunsets. But it was never really that. Never. And yet the myth is still elegantly served in places like the Boone Hall Plantation, with its famed Avenue of the Oaks, stunning antebellum ambience, and sturdy row of slave quarters. They boast here that these are the best preserved slave quarters to be found anywhere in the South. The myth still thrives in the tourist trade. Of course, no more than a fraction of the plantation class even existed on such a grand scale. It was strange. 3/4 of the men who fought for the Confederacy had no slaves and no connection with any of this. Slavery, Alistair Cook has written, was never enough to bind them. It was their sense of having a homeland that did that. And the South, he tells us, is still a separate culture with its own literature, idiom, diet, mores, and pervading sense of both irony and tragedy. It was all of that, aggravated by the gross mistakes of Reconstruction, that prolonged the epilogue of the war a full century. The pitched battles of the civil rights struggle in the 60s finally exposed the false promise of the myth, the lie that had been lived too long. But when the battle lines of the civil rights revolution moved northward to cities like our own, it relieved the historical burden of the South, even as it was revealing at long last the full extent of the hypocrisy of the North. The South has reached an accord with its past, but the grand nostalgia is still a powerful force. You'll find it boyishly rampant at places like the Citadel, the West Point of the South, whose graduates once flushed Confederate ranks.
Is that understood?
To the cadets, the legend of who fired the first shot is still big sport.
It's kind of neat to say that you do go to the school that did have 2 cadets that fired the first 2 shots, or the first shots. So I guess you can take pride in that.
But that harmless if hollow bravado is hardly confined to young romantics.
It's there in a crass sense, or vulgar sense too. There are many parties for the debutante age crowd in Charleston, which end with a reel, the music of which is Dixie.
So it is that the Civil War is remembered. The wistful yearnings linger, the lost illusions are still cherished. After all these years, it is still a thing to brood over, for it was a terrible time, full of veiled meanings. This is Clark Booth reporting.